The church bell tolled across the dusty prairie, each strike heavy as a hammer, and Eleanor James tightened her trembling hands around the wildflower bouquet as though the stems could anchor her to the earth. She was 30 years old, a woman long past the town's expectations for marriage, and tonight she was a bride, though not one soul in the pews dared to whisper congratulations. Air in the wooden chapel smelled of pine resin and fear. Dust motes floated through shafts of golden light from the high windows, but they seemed to dance in silence, muffled by the heavy tension pressing against the walls. Every gaze, every narrowed eye, every pursed mouth rested not on Eleanor, but on the tall figure standing at the altar. He was Apache. The man they called Taza stood bareheaded, his long black hair gleaming like obsidian, his copper skin catching the last flare of sunset through the stained glass. Beaded strands and a carved bone pendant hung across his broad chest, and though his face betrayed no emotion, the way he held himself unyielding, powerful, made the townsfolk shrink back. His people had raided these lands, fought battles with ranchers and soldiers alike, but tonight he was here under truce. Tonight he was a groom, and Eleanor, trembling yet unbroken, was his bride. She could feel her mother's absence like a knife. Her father had passed years ago, the ranch left in her weary hands, and no brother or cousin came forward to shield her from this fate. She had resisted the arrangement, but the sheriff's warning was final. Marry Taza, and the town might know peace. Refuse and blood would follow. The preacher's voice cracked as he read the vows, his lips dry, his Bible trembling in his hands. Eleanor barely heard the words. She saw only Taza's eyes, dark, endless, and unblinking. Eyes that had seen more death than she could fathom. Eyes that seemed to be studying her, not with desire, nor with cruelty, but with a strange, quiet calculation, as though she were both stranger and secret. When the preacher asked, "Do you take this man?" her throat locked. For one breathless second, the silence was deafening. She felt the townsfolk's stares like heat on her back. She thought of the prairie nights spent alone, of whispers behind her named spinster, barren, forgotten. She thought of the fire that had nearly claimed her ranch last winter, and the day she had stood in the ashes, vowing she would not be broken, and so she lifted her chin and said, "Steady, I do." A ripple of gasps surged through the chapel. Taza did not blink. His deep voice rolled out like thunder. "I do." The words sealed her fate. The preacher closed his book with a thud that echoed too loud, and before Eleanor could catch her breath, Taza reached for her hand. His palm was rough, his grip unyielding yet not cruel. As they turned to walk down the aisle, no music played. No cheers rose, only the heavy scrape of boots shifting in discomfort, the hiss of whispered curses, the crackle of anger suppressed. Outside, the sun dipped behind the horizon, bleeding the sky into shades of crimson and violet. Eleanor's dress, white but simple, brushed against the chapel steps as she descended beside the man who was now her husband. The dry wind whipped across the plain, carrying the smell of sagebrush and distant smoke. Behind them, the church doors shut with a sound that felt final, like the closing of a coffin. Ahead of them waited the long road to her ranch, where her wedding night would begin. But Eleanor could not quiet the pounding in her chest, for she knew something the townsfolk did not. This marriage was not only for peace, it was a bargain struck in secrets, and she alone carried the key. And Taza, silent and watchful at her side, walked as though he already knew. The sky was streaked with violet and crimson as Eleanor James mounted her mare, her hands trembling against the reins. Behind her, the chapel bell gave one last hollow chime, a sound that seemed to chase her down the dusty road. She did not look back. She could not bear to see the stares of the townsfolk, their eyes burning with fear, judgment, and something darker, betrayal. Beside her, Taza swung onto a tall chestnut horse with a grace that unsettled her. The animal obeyed him without hesitation, though he gave no command in English. A low murmur in Apache, deep and steady, carried between man and beast, and Eleanor felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The world she knew of sermons, ranch chores, and gossiping neighbors suddenly seemed too small, fragile compared to the raw, untamed presence of the man who now rode as her husband. The prairie stretched wide before them, a sea of grasses rolling under the evening wind. Sagebrush released its sharp, earthy scent as the horses' hooves struck the ground, mingling with the faint smoke of campfires drifting from the distant hills. Eleanor felt the weight of silence pressing down. The sheriff had not come to see them off, nor had any townsfolk offered blessing or protection. She was utterly alone except for Taza. Her throat tightened. "You don't have to grip my hand so tight," she whispered, remembering how he had taken it in the chapel. His head turned slowly, his gaze unreadable. Then he released the reins with one hand and held it out toward her, palm up, as if to prove he meant no harm. She hesitated, confused. His hands were scarred, rough with work and war, yet steady, so steady it almost frightened her. She looked away, refusing to meet his eyes. The silence grew unbearable. Eleanor clutched at words like lifelines. "I suppose you think this is all victory for you," she said, bitterness sharper than she intended. The town handing over a woman to buy peace. Taza's voice was low, deep, carrying the rhythm of desert winds. "You think I wanted this?" The words struck her like a slap. She turned in her saddle, stunned. His eyes were on the horizon, not on her, but the muscles in his jaw tightened as though he carried a weight heavier than hers. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the warrior the town feared, but a man bound to something he, too, had not chosen. The miles passed. The prairie dusk gave way to night, stars pricking through a velvet sky. The moon rose, silver and cold, casting the land in a ghostly glow. Eleanor's ranch house appeared at last a lonely silhouette against the open land. The windmill creaked, the corrals stood empty, and the clapboard house waited like a dark sentinel. Eleanor dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling. She had spent 10 years tending this land alone since her father's death, fighting storms and droughts. Tonight, for the first time, she dreaded crossing its threshold. She turned to face Taza, expecting him to claim the house as his own, perhaps to demand entry before her. Instead, he stood beside his horse, silent, surveying the land with an unreadable expression. His chest rose and fell slowly, his silhouette broad and unmoving in the silver light. "You're home," he said at last. His English was rough, clipped, yet clear. "I do not enter until you wish it." The words knocked the breath from her lungs. She stared, stunned. In her mind, she had prepared for commands, for a night where her will meant nothing. Yet here he was, waiting, as if the choice was hers. She found her voice only in a whisper. "Why?" He met her eyes then, dark and bottomless. "Because a cage is not a home. Not for a horse. Not for a woman. Not for a man." The night air hummed around her. For the first time, Eleanor felt something flicker beneath her fear, not trust, not yet, but the faintest spark of curiosity. She stepped onto the porch, her dress brushing against the wooden boards, her hand hesitating on the doorknob. Behind her, Taza leaned against the fence post, arms folded, watching the stars with the patience of stone. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was her wedding night. She had been given to a man the town feared, a man she did not know, and yet, in the silence of the prairie, she felt the ground shift beneath her. Perhaps he was not what they had told her. Perhaps neither of them were, and as she opened the door to her empty house, she knew the night would reveal more than either expected. The door creaked open beneath Eleanor's hand, and the familiar scent of dry wood and hearth ash rushed to meet her. For 10 years, this house had been her fortress against loneliness and the whispers of the town. Tonight, it felt smaller, its shadows deeper, as though the walls themselves braced for the stranger standing outside. She stepped inside, her boots tapping against the worn planks. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint squeak of the windmill outside and the restless snort of the horses at the corral. She turned, expecting Taza to follow, but he remained on the porch, arms folded, his broad chest glimmering faintly in the lamplight she had just lit. "You'll catch cold," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do not," Taza replied. His English was still rough, every word shaped as though weighed before leaving his lips. "But I wait. You must want me here." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the matchbox in her hand. No man had ever said such words to her. Not the ranch hands who had tried their luck, not the merchants who sneered at her age, and certainly not the sheriff who had spoken of her marriage like a transaction. Yet this Apache warrior, whom they all feared, stood at her threshold and offered her the choice. She lit the lantern, flame blooming against the glass, and placed it on the table. The glow reached across the room, painting the rough walls in gold and shadow. Her throat tightened. "Come in," she said. Taza stepped through the doorway. His presence filled the room, vast and steady, like the mountains themselves had entered her home. He looked around slowly, taking in the shelves of worn books, the quilt folded neatly over the rocking chair, the row of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. His gaze lingered on none of it, yet Eleanor had the strange sense he understood more in silence than most men did with words. She busied herself at the stove, striking flint, setting kindling ablaze. The simple ritual calmed her trembling hands. "You must be hungry," she said, not looking at him. "I ate," he said. His voice was low, not dismissive but certain, like he wanted her to save her strength. She swallowed, wishing her heart would slow. "Then sit at least." A man should not stand all night. Taza moved toward the table, the light catching the lines of muscle across his chest, the scars that spoke of battle she dared not imagine. He lowered himself into the chair with quiet ease, yet his eyes never stopped watching her. Not as a hunter watches prey, nor as a man watches a woman with lust, but as if she were a riddle he intended to solve. Eleanor poured herself a cup of water, her hand shaking so slightly the rim clinked against the tin pitcher. She felt the weight of his gaze and forced herself to meet it. "They think I'll break," she said suddenly, the words spilling before she could stop them. "The town. They think this night will undo me." A shadow of something flickered across his face, not amusement, not pity. "You do not break," Taza said, her breath caught. "You don't know me. I know your eyes," he replied. "I saw them in the fire. When you spoke in the church, they were not afraid. Only angry." Eleanor's chest tightened. How could he see her so clearly when others never had? The sheriff, the preacher, even her neighbors, none had looked past her age, her quiet defiance, her solitude. Yet this man, foreign in tongue and land, had pierced straight to the core of her. The fire crackled. Outside, the coyotes began to call, their voices rising in mournful chorus. Eleanor's skin prickled at the sound, but Taza did not stir. He seemed as much a part of the night as the stars themselves. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling but strong. "This house is mine. My father built it with his hands. I've kept it standing through storms, drought, and fire. Whatever bargain the town struck with you, you should know I am not theirs to give." The silence stretched long. Then Taza inclined his head, slow and deliberate. "Then I belong to you," he said. Her heart lurched. The words were simple, yet they echoed louder than any vow in the chapel. For the first time that night, Eleanor's fear did not feel like a burden, it felt like a choice. The lantern flickered. The shadows pressed close. and between them something unspoken began to take root. The wind howled outside the ranch house, rattling the shutters as if the plains themselves sought entry. Inside, the lantern's flame flickered, casting shifting shadows across the wooden walls. Eleanor James sat at the far edge of her father's table, her hands folded tight in her lap. Across from her, Taza sat like a stone carved from the earth itself, silent, still, but watchful. The quiet stretched so long it seemed to press against her chest. Finally, Eleanor broke it. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked, her voice low. "A marriage, I mean. You could have taken peace another way." Taza lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "There is no peace," he said at last. "Not between your people and mine. Only bargains." This was theirs. His bluntness struck her harder than any insult could. Eleanor looked down, tracing the grooves her father had carved into the table when he built it. "So I'm a bargain," she murmured. "You are a bridge," Taza corrected. "Or a weapon. Which one you choose." The words sent a chill through her. She had expected dominance, even cruelty, but instead his sentences landed like truths she had long feared to admit. She glanced at him again, at the scars across his chest and arms. They told stories her imagination hesitated to fill. "Do you resent it?" she asked before she could stop herself. For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire cracked. Coyotes wailed somewhere out in the dark. Then Taza's voice came, low and steady. "I do not resent the woman. I resent the chain." The admission stirred something deep inside her. She had lived under chains too, of whispers, of expectations, of loneliness pressed on her by the town that judged her at every turn. In that moment, across the table, she felt an unexpected kinship with the man they all called enemy. She rose suddenly, needing movement, needing distance from the weight of his gaze. She crossed to the hearth, poking at the fire until sparks leapt upward. "When I was 16, she began, not knowing why she spoke, "I was promised to a rancher's son. But he left me waiting at the altar. Said he wanted someone younger, prettier. Since then, every look, every whisper from this town has been the same. She's too old. She'd die alone." Her throat tightened. "So maybe we are both chains to each other." When she turned back, Taza was watching her with something new in his eyes. Not pity, he had no softness for that, but recognition. A silent understanding that needed no words. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight painting his bronze skin in gold. "In my village," he said, "a woman of 30 is not old. She is wise. She leads. She carries life and story." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "They do not see you." Eleanor's breath caught. No one had ever spoken of her like that. Not once in 30 years. Her hands gripped the back of the chair as though to steady herself. "Why are you telling me this?" Taza's eyes did not waver. "Because tonight they want me to take what is not freely given." "I will not." The words hit her with force she had not braced for. Heat rose to her cheeks, shame and relief tangled together. She had dreaded this night more than any other in her life, steeling herself for surrender. And yet here he sat, refusing to be the monster the town had painted him to be. Silence fell again, but this time it was different, no longer brittle with fear, but heavy with something unspoken. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could see the shadow shifting across his shoulders, the gleam of his bone pendant. He was dangerous, yes, but not in the way they told her. His danger lay in how easily he unsettled her walls, how swiftly he cracked her defenses. Finally, she whispered, "So what happens now?" Taza's gaze flicked to the window, to the endless stretch of prairie where the moon hung heavy and pale. "Now," he said, "the night is long. And truth waits in silence." Eleanor swallowed hard. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether this marriage would bind them in war or in something else entirely. But as the firelight danced between them, she knew one thing: the night would not break her, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would not break him either. The fire had burned low, its glow painting the walls in soft, restless light. Eleanor James sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers, though it did little to calm the storm in her chest. Across the table, Taza remained still, silent as a carved figure, his long black hair catching the faint gleam of the lantern. She wanted to ask him more about his people, about why he had agreed to this marriage, but the words tangled on her tongue. It was not easy to bear herself, not to a man who could undo her world with a single glance. And yet, before she could gather the courage, the sound came, a knocked-out sharp, urgent, echoing through the wooden walls. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. She rose halfway from her chair, the cup trembling in her hand. No one came to her ranch at this hour. No one dared. Taza's head snapped toward the door, every muscle in his body tightening. In one smooth motion, he stood, his chair scraping back across the floor. His hand brushed instinctively toward the knife at his hip. Eleanor swallowed hard. Who could that be? He did not answer. He moved with measured steps, his bare chest rising and falling with steady breaths, though his eyes burned with the focus of a predator. He gestured to her, sharp and commanding. Stay. But Eleanor, stubborn as the land she had fought to keep, did not sit. She followed a step behind him as he crossed the room. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Taza placed his hand against the door, listening. For a heartbeat, all Eleanor could hear was the moan of wind outside, the faint rattle of the shutters. Then, in a voice low and fierce, he asked through the wood, "Who comes?" Silence. Then a reply, rough and slurred, "Sheriff's men." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She pushed past Taza before she could think better of it. "Sheriff's men? At this hour?" The voice came again, sharper now. "Open up, Eleanor. We need a word." Her mind raced. The town had sent them, of course they had. They could not bear the thought of her wedding night passing in peace. They wanted to see if the Apache would claim her, if he would break her spirit, if their bargain had teeth. Taza's hand closed around her wrist, firm but not cruel. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw the silent question, "Do you trust me?" Her pulse thundered in her ears. She nodded once. Together, they opened the door. 3 men stood on the porch, their faces half lit by the lantern light spilling from inside. Dust clung to their coats, whiskey clung to their breath. Eleanor recognized them, ranch hands loyal to the sheriff, men who had sneered at her in town. One held a rifle loose in his grip, though his eyes never left Taza. "Well," one of them drawled, spitting to the side. "Ain't this a sight?" The spinster and her savage. Heat flamed in Eleanor's chest. She opened her mouth, but Taza stepped forward, his towering frame filling the doorway. The lamplight caught on the beads across his chest, on the scars carved into his skin. His presence was a wall of strength, silent yet unyielding. The man with the rifle shifted uneasily. "Sheriff just wants to be sure she's safe." His eyes flicked toward Eleanor with a mocking curl of his lip. "You safe, Miss James?" Eleanor's hands trembled, but she straightened her spine. She thought of the whispers, the judgment, the way they had cast her into this marriage like throwing scraps to wolves. Her voice came sharp, steady. "Safer than I've ever been." The words startled even her. But when she said them, she felt Taza's gaze slide toward her, steady, unreadable but no longer cold. The men muttered among themselves, the false bravado in their faces thinning. Taza said nothing, only stood unmoving, the firelight gleaming on his broad shoulders. After a tense silence, the man with the rifle spat again. We'll be watching." Then they turned, boots crunching across the dirt, vanishing into the prairie night. The door shut with a heavy thud. The silence returned, thick and pressing. Eleanor leaned against the wood, her heart hammering. "They wanted me to fear you," she whispered. "But tonight, I feared them more." Taza's voice was low, steady. "Fear is their chain. You broke it." Her breath caught. She looked at him then, not as the town had painted him, not as the stranger forced upon her, but as a man who had stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, when others tried to tear her down. For the first time that night, Eleanor felt the stirrings of something dangerous and new. Not fear, not obligation. Something that could not be forced by bargains or chains, something that might grow if the night allowed it. The storm finally broke near dawn, leaving the ranch house wrapped in the hush of damp earth and the faint smell of pine carried on the morning air. Eleanor had not slept. She sat near the hearth, her white dress rumpled and stained with soot, watching the last embers fade to dull orange. Every crackle of dying flame seemed to echo her heartbeat. Behind her, she heard the steady rhythm of breathing. The Apache warrior had dozed against the wall, head tilted back, long black hair spilling over his shoulders like a dark river. Even in sleep, he looked unyielding, as though danger itself would not dare wake him. Her lips pressed together. "What am I doing?" she thought. She had been given to him like livestock, her father's final act of cruelty disguised as survival. And yet, she realized with a pang, she had not been harmed. Not once had Taza forced her hand or her body. He had only watched her, patient and silent, as if waiting for her to decide whether she would fight or fold. When she rose to her feet, her bare toes brushing the cool wooden floor, his eyes snapped open. Black, sharp, but not cruel. He did not move at first, just studied her as though she were a creature caught between running and staying. "You did not sleep," he said softly, his English thick with an accent but steady. "No." Her voice cracked with exhaustion. He rose then, muscles rippling under skin that caught the pale light filtering through the window. The tribal jewelry around his neck rattled faintly, beads tapping against one another. He stepped closer, not threatening, just near enough that she could feel his warmth. "You think I will take you," he said, voice low. "That I will make you mine because your father gave you away." His eyes narrowed. "But I am not him." Her breath caught. "Then why accept me? Why stand here in this house, watching me as though I belonged to you?" Taza's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking toward the window where rain still dripped from the eaves. "Because the land is changing. Because men like your father think gold and cattle are worth more than blood. I took you not to hurt you, but to show him he cannot trade lives without cost." His words sank deep, stirring something sharp inside her. For so long, Eleanor had been a pawn in her father's dealings, marriage contracts, whispered bargains, lies spoken over supper. And now here was this man, this stranger, telling her she was not property, even as the world insisted she was. "You say I am not a prisoner," she whispered, "but I cannot leave. Where would I go? My father has no home for me. The town whispers against me." "You," she faltered, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her body, "you are all I have." For the first time, Taza's stern expression softened. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to step back. She didn't. His hand touched hers, rough with scars but steady. "You are not mine by chains," he said. "If you stay, it will be because you choose." Her throat tightened, tears welling despite her will to remain hard. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father, not the suitors who measured her worth in dowry. For 30 years she had been silenced, bartered, ignored. And now on this storm-washed morning, an Apache warrior offered her something no one else ever had. Choice. Eleanor closed her eyes, her body trembling as though she stood at the edge of a canyon. She could leap into fear, or she could leap into something unknown, something dangerous but alive. When she opened her eyes, Taza was still there, waiting. She pressed her hand tighter into his. A silent answer she barely understood herself. The silence between them shifted, no longer cold, no longer jagged. It was fragile, yes, but also tender. A bridge built not of duty but of possibility. Outside, the storm clouds broke, and the first streaks of sunrise painted the wet earth in hues of gold. Eleanor drew in a shaky breath. "Then let the choice be mine," she said quietly. And for the first time since her wedding night began, she felt like the ground beneath her feet belonged to her. The morning light crept slowly across the wooden floorboards, chasing away the last shadows of the storm. Eleanor stood with Taza's hand in hers, the warmth of his skin grounding her in a reality she had never expected. For 30 years, she had lived at the mercy of others' decisions. Now, standing before the Apache warrior who had been painted to her as a savage, she realized he was the first to offer her something she had never been. Granted freedom of choice. Her voice wavered as she broke the silence. "If I stay, it will not be easy. You know that. The town will spit my name. My father will call me dead to him." Taza's dark gaze held hers, unwavering. "I know." He stepped closer, the beads of his necklace glinting faintly in the morning light. "But a woman's worth is not in a father's word, nor in a town's gossip. It is in her fire." His hand brushed lightly against her cheek, not claiming, just daring to offer. "And I see fire in you." The word struck her harder than a whip. She wanted to deny them, to retreat into the shell of obedience she had known all her life, but the truth had already kindled inside her. That fire had been buried under years of silence, but here, in this cabin with a man the world told her to fear, she felt it roar awake. She pulled away, pacing the floor, her dress sweeping dust into the air. "I don't know how to be this. I don't know how to live outside their rules. I don't even know if I can." Taza watched her, silent. Then, with the same calm that had carried him through storm and shadow, he sank to the floor near the fire. He picked up a piece of charred wood and began to draw on the planks, his movements steady. Eleanor leaned forward despite herself, curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are you doing?" she asked. He did not look up. "My mother once told me, when the storm breaks the branches, you carve the broken wood into something new. I draw so, you see." He finished the last stroke, then leaned back. On the floor he had etched 2 figures, one a woman, her hair flowing, the other a warrior with a spear. But between them he had drawn a river and a bridge connecting both sides. Her throat tightened. "A bridge," she whispered. "Yes." He looked up at her. "Not chains. A bridge." Tears blurred her vision, and for the first time since her father had dragged her into the church to seal her unwanted marriage, she let them fall. She knelt beside him, her trembling hand tracing the crude lines of the bridge on the floor. "You would really give me that? A choice?" "I would." His voice was steady, almost fierce. "Because to take you without your fire would be to take only ashes. And I do not want ashes." Eleanor's breath shuddered. She turned toward him, her face inches from his, her chest rising and falling with the weight of every decision she had ever been denied. She thought of her father's hard eyes, the town's whispers, the cold bed she had always feared. And then she thought of the storm breaking, of Taza standing in the doorway drenched in rain, of the way his hand had not forced but waited. For the first time in her life, she decided for herself. "I stay," she whispered. "Not because my father gave me. Not because you took me. Because I choose." Something unspoken passed between them, fragile and powerful all at once. Taza reached for her hand again, and when she did not pull away, he drew her into his arms. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong, like the land itself beneath her feet. the cabin no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the beginning of something uncharted, dangerous, but alive. When she finally lifted her face to his, dawn had already claimed the sky, turning the wet earth outside into a canvas of gold. And in that moment, on her wedding night that had stretched into morning, Eleanor was no longer her father's daughter, no longer the town's whispered shame. She was a woman reborn, standing on the bridge she had chosen to cross. And Taza, the warrior who had once been her captor, was now the keeper of a promise she had carved with her own fire.